They didn't fall in a great battle. They weren't wiped out in a single war. They simply disappeared, while history moved on. You know the name. You've seen the legend. But this is the real story of the Mohicans, a people erased without the world noticing. Subscribe to Fragments of History for dark cinematic stories of forgotten peoples. Leave a like if you believe lost histories still matter. And comment below, what city are you watching from? Before maps, before borders, before the name America was even conceived, the land that would become the northeastern United States was home to a world that had existed for thousands of years, complete, complex, and self-sustaining. This was not wilderness. It was territory, carefully managed and deeply understood by the people who lived within it. Every river had a name, every forest had purpose. Every season brought rhythms of movement, harvest, and survival that had been refined across generations. The land itself was different then. Forests stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles. Oak, maple, birch, and pine creating canopies so dense that sunlight reached the ground in scattered fragments. Rivers ran clear and cold, teeming with fish that sustained communities through winters when hunting was scarce. The air carried sounds that would soon disappear forever. Languages never written, songs never recorded, the everyday noise of lives lived in harmony with surroundings that demanded respect. Among the peoples who called this land home were the Mohicans, known to themselves as the Moheakan, which translates roughly to people of the waters that are never still. The name reflected their relationship with the Hudson River and its tributaries, waterways that served as highways, fishing grounds, and spiritual centers. The Mohicans were not nomadic wanderers. They were a settled people who practiced seasonal migration, moving between established villages according to the rhythms of hunting, fishing, and agriculture. Summer camps near rivers for fishing and planting. Winter villages in sheltered valleys where stored food and constructed lodges protected against harsh weather. This movement was not random but carefully planned, passed down through oral tradition that functioned as both history and practical guide. Their social structure was built on clans, extended family groups that determined identity, responsibility, and connection to the broader community. Clan membership was matrilineal, traced through mothers rather than fathers. Women held significant authority in domestic and political spheres, choosing leaders and making decisions about land use and resource allocation. This was not a society without structure or governance. It simply organized differently than the European systems that would soon collide with it. Leadership emerged through consensus rather than force. Decisions affecting the community required discussion, negotiation, and agreement rather than top-down commands. This process was slower but created stability through shared investment in outcomes. Oral tradition was the backbone of Mohican identity. Stories passed from elders to children carried everything the society needed to survive. Where to fish, when to plant, how to read weather patterns, which plants healed and which poisoned, the history of conflicts with neighboring tribes, the proper rituals for honoring the spirits that inhabited the land. Without writing, memory became sacred. Elders who could recall generations of history were treasured. Songs and stories were not entertainment, but survival encoded in narrative. Lose the stories, and you lost the knowledge. Lose the elders, and you lost the past. Warfare existed but functioned differently than European models. The Mohicans fought when necessary, defending territory, settling disputes, responding to raids from rival tribes. But warfare was not about conquest or expansion. It was about defense and balance. Raids were small-scale, focused on specific grievances or resource competition. Large-scale campaigns to annihilate enemies were rare. Victory meant restoration of balance, not domination. This approach created a regional system where tribes coexisted through negotiation, trade, and occasional conflict that rarely threatened total destruction. The Mohicans traded with the Moheakan, allied with some groups against others, maintained relationships that were sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, but always bounded by shared understanding of how conflict worked. The land sustained this way of life. Forests provided game, materials for shelter and fuel for fires. Rivers offered fish and transportation. Agricultural plots, carefully managed through controlled burning and crop rotation, produced corn, beans, and squash that supplemented hunting and gathering. It was not effortless abundance, but it was sufficient. The balance between taking and preserving had been achieved through centuries of adaptation. Spiritually, the Mohicans understood themselves as part of the land, not separate from it. The concept of ownership as Europeans practiced it, land as property that could be bought, sold, and exclusively controlled, did not exist. Land was communal, held in trust for future generations, used but not possessed. This worldview would prove catastrophic when confronted with colonial legal systems built on entirely opposite assumptions. The Mohican world before European contact was not paradise. There was hunger during hard winters. There were conflicts with neighboring tribes. There was disease, though nothing approaching what was coming. There was loss, hardship, and struggle, but there was also stability, a way of life that had sustained itself for thousands of years through adaptation and deep knowledge of the environment. This was the world that existed before contact, complete unto itself, functioning according to its own logic, connected to other tribes through networks of trade and diplomacy that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. It would not survive the arrival of ships carrying people who saw the same land and imagined something entirely different, who looked at forests and saw timber and farmland, who looked at rivers and saw transportation for goods and armies, who looked at the Mohicans and saw obstacles, labor, or nothing at all. The collision was coming. And when it arrived, it would destroy not through conquest, but through something far more insidious, the slow, invisible erosion of everything that made Mohican life possible. The Mohicans have been romanticized, mythologized, and reduced to symbols in ways that erase who they actually were. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what existed, not the noble savages of fiction, but real people navigating survival with sophistication that colonial observers failed to recognize. The Mohicans were a confederacy, multiple villages united by language, culture, and kinship, but politically autonomous. Each village governed itself through councils, where sachems and clan leaders debated decisions affecting their community. This decentralization meant no single person spoke for all Mohicans, no capital city commanded the whole, no hierarchy dictated from above. To Europeans, accustomed to kings and centralized authority, this looked like chaos. It was not. It was distributed governance that prevented tyranny and ensured decisions reflected community needs rather than individual ambition. But it also meant the Mohicans couldn't negotiate as a unified bloc, couldn't respond to external threats with centralized military force, and couldn't compete with colonial governments that spoke with single voices backed by institutional power. Daily life was shaped entirely by survival imperatives. Men hunted deer, bear, and smaller game using bows, traps, and knowledge of animal behavior accumulated over lifetimes. Women cultivated the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a symbiotic system where each plant supported the others. Children learned skills through observation and participation. Education integrated into every activity rather than separated into formal instruction. Seasons dictated rhythm. Spring meant planting and fishing as ice melted from rivers. Summer brought tending crops and gathering wild foods. Fall required harvest and preparation for winter, smoking meat, drying fish, storing grain in underground pits lined with bark. Winter meant endurance, conserving energy and resources while waiting for the cycle to begin again. This was not primitive simplicity. It was complex adaptation to an environment that killed those who miscalculated. Every activity required knowledge: which fish ran in which season, how to track game through forests, when to burn fields to prevent destructive wildfires, how to preserve food without refrigeration. Survival demanded expertise that took decades to master. The Mohicans participated in extensive trade networks that stretched hundreds of miles. Wampum, beads made from shells, served as currency and diplomatic tool, used in treaties, marriages, and condolence ceremonies. Furs, tobacco, and food were exchanged with neighboring tribes. Coastal groups provided shells and ocean fish. Inland tribes offered hides and forest products. These networks were economic, but also political and social. Trade relationships created alliances. Intermarriage between tribes established kinship bonds that could be invoked during conflicts. The movement of goods carried information, news of wars or famines or opportunities that allowed communities to adapt to changing circumstances. Spiritually, the Mohicans understood the world as inhabited by forces that required respect and negotiation. Spirits dwelled in animals, plants, rivers, and storms. Hunting was not simply killing, but a relationship where animals gave themselves to humans who honored them properly. Failure to perform correct rituals risked offending spirits and bringing misfortune. Dreams held prophetic significance. Visions could guide decisions about warfare, hunting, or healing. Shamans, individuals with special connections to spiritual realms, interpreted signs, performed ceremonies, and mediated between human and non-human worlds. This was not superstition, but a coherent system for understanding reality that integrated observation, tradition, and spiritual interpretation. Leadership emerged through consensus and demonstrated capability rather than inheritance or force. Sachems were chosen for wisdom, oratory skill, and ability to build agreement. Their authority depended on maintaining community support. Lose that, and their influence evaporated. Women, particularly elder women within clans, held significant power in selecting and removing leaders who failed to serve collective interests. Decisions required extensive discussion. War councils debated whether to fight, flee, or negotiate. Planting councils determined crop distribution. Disputes between individuals were mediated through clan leaders who sought resolutions that preserved social cohesion. This process was slow, often frustrating, but it created shared responsibility for outcomes. Mohican identity was not racial or biological in the modern sense. It was cultural and relational. You were Mohican if you spoke the language, followed the customs, participated in ceremonies, and maintained kinship ties. Adoption was common. Captives, refugees, and individuals from other tribes could become Mohican through integration. Identity was performed and renewed, not fixed by birth. This fluid identity would later be weaponized against them. Colonial authorities and later historians would argue that intermarriage and adoption meant the Mohicans had mixed themselves out of existence. But this perspective imposed European concepts of racial purity onto a culture that had always understood identity as something lived rather than inherited. The Mohicans were not frozen in time, unchanged since ancient origins. They were adaptive. They incorporated new technologies when useful. Metal tools replaced stone. European cloth supplemented animal hides. New crops were integrated into agricultural systems. Adaptation was strength, not corruption of authenticity. This adaptability would become survival strategy when contact with Europeans transformed everything, but it would also be used to erase them. The argument that adopting colonial ways meant they were no longer real Indians, that change proved their culture had died even when people themselves survived. The Mohicans were rooted, but not primitive, complex but not civilized in European terms. sophisticated in ways colonists refused to recognize, because acknowledging that sophistication would have complicated justifications for dispossession. They were people, flawed, creative, struggling, and thriving according to their own measures of success. They had conflicts, made mistakes, faced internal divisions, and sometimes failed to adapt quickly enough to changing circumstances. But they were not waiting for civilization to arrive. They were civilization, just one that organized itself differently, valued different things, and understood the world through frameworks that Europeans found incomprehensible. And when those two worlds collided, the Mohicans would discover that survival required more than adaptation. It required navigating systems designed to erase them while pretending to offer partnership. The first Europeans to enter Mohican territory came not as conquerors, but as traders. They arrived in the early 1600s, Dutch merchants seeking furs, profit, and passage through lands they barely understood. To the Mohicans, these strangers were curiosities, pale-skinned, strangely dressed, speaking incomprehensible languages, and offering goods unlike anything they had seen before. The initial encounters were cautious, but not hostile. The Mohicans had experience with foreign peoples through their trade networks. They understood diplomacy, negotiation, and the value of new relationships. The Dutch wanted furs, beaver pelts particularly, which were abundant in Mohican territory. In exchange, they offered metal tools, cloth, glass beads, and firearms. These goods were revolutionary. Metal axes cut faster and lasted longer than stone tools. Iron kettles were more durable than pottery. Glass beads were more uniform than shell wampum. And firearms, arquebuses, and later muskets changed warfare entirely. A hunter with a gun could kill game from distances that bows couldn't match. A warrior with a firearm held advantages that traditional weapons couldn't counter. The Mohicans, like other tribes encountering Europeans, quickly recognized the value of these goods. What began as curiosity transformed into desire, then necessity. Once you had used a metal axe, returning to stone tools felt like handicapping yourself. Once neighboring tribes acquired guns, not having them meant military vulnerability. This created the first invisible chain of dependence. To obtain European goods, the Mohicans needed to provide what Europeans wanted: furs. This meant intensifying hunting beyond subsistence needs, pursuing animals not for food, but for trade value. The sustainable relationship with the land that had defined Mohican life for centuries began eroding under pressure to produce surplus for exchange. But the most destructive European import was not metal or cloth, it was alcohol. Indigenous peoples of the Americas had no tradition of distilled spirits. Fermented beverages existed in some cultures, but nothing approached the potency of European rum and brandy. When introduced to alcohol, many Mohicans experienced it as something between medicine and magic, a substance that produced euphoria, reduced inhibitions, and temporarily erased the hardships of life. Traders quickly recognized alcohol's value as a trade good. It was cheap to produce, easy to transport, and created demand that furs and other goods did not. Communities that might have negotiated shrewdly when sober made disastrous agreements while intoxicated. Individuals who had been respected hunters and leaders became dependent on alcohol, their judgment compromised, their contributions to community survival diminished. Social disruption followed. Domestic violence increased. Hunting efficiency declined as men spent resources on alcohol rather than providing for families. Traditional forms of authority, elder wisdom, consensus building, spiritual guidance, lost influence when individuals prioritized immediate gratification over collective well-being. The Mohicans recognized the problem. Leaders tried to restrict alcohol trade, but the decentralized nature of their political structure made enforcement difficult. Individual villages made their own decisions. Young men seeking status ignored elder warnings. And traders always found someone willing to exchange furs for rum. Then came the missionaries, Dutch Reformed clergy initially, later English Protestants. They arrived with genuine belief that they were saving souls, offering eternal life through Christianity. But their message came packaged with cultural destruction. Missionaries taught that Mohican spiritual practices were devil worship, that their marriage customs were immoral, that their governance systems were primitive, that their entire way of life needed to be abandoned to achieve salvation. Conversion meant not just accepting Christ, but rejecting Mohican identity itself. Some Mohicans converted, sometimes from genuine spiritual conviction, sometimes from pragmatic recognition that aligning with colonial religion provided advantages. But conversion created divisions. Christian converts often settled in separate villages, adopted European dress and customs, and distanced themselves from traditional practices. This fractured communities along religious lines, weakening the social cohesion that had been essential to Mohican survival. Early alliances formed between Mohicans and colonists that seemed mutually beneficial. The Mohicans gained access to trade goods and support against rival tribes. The Dutch gained guides, intelligence about regional politics, and military allies who understood the terrain. Treaties were negotiated, agreements made, relationships established that both sides believed would benefit them. But beneath the surface of partnership, a power imbalance was emerging that the Mohicans didn't fully recognize. The colonists were part of larger systems. European empires, global trade networks, institutional structures that could mobilize resources the Mohicans couldn't match. Each agreement, each treaty, each trade relationship subtly shifted power away from indigenous autonomy toward colonial dependence. The changes came without violence, at least initially. No armies invaded Mohican territory. No battles destroyed their villages. Instead, transformation occurred through accumulated choices that seemed reasonable at the time, but collectively undermined the foundations of Mohican independence. Accepting metal tools meant depending on trade to replace them when they broke. Acquiring firearms meant needing ammunition and powder that only Europeans provided. Converting to Christianity meant questioning traditions that had sustained communities for generations. Forming alliances with colonists meant entanglement in conflicts between European powers who viewed indigenous peoples as pawns rather than partners. Each step seemed small, each choice made sense within its context. But collectively, they were erasing autonomy while appearing to offer opportunity. The Mohicans were not naive. They recognized that change was occurring, that their world was being transformed. Leaders debated how to respond, some advocating integration, others resistance, most seeking middle paths that preserved what could be preserved while adapting to undeniable new realities. But they were making these decisions without full information. They didn't know that European diseases were already spreading, that their population would soon be devastated. They didn't know that colonial settlements would expand exponentially, that land they considered infinite would become scarce. They didn't know that treaties written in languages they couldn't read would later be used to justify their dispossession. They were negotiating survival in a game where the rules were hidden and changing constantly. And the most dangerous part of this early contact period was that nothing seemed catastrophic yet. There was no apocalyptic invasion to resist. Just gradual changes that accumulated into transformation so complete that by the time its scope became clear, reversing course was already impossible. The Mohicans had survived wars, famines and harsh winters. They had adapted to changing climates and shifting alliances, but nothing in their history prepared them for what arrived invisibly, carried in the breath and touch of European traders. Epidemic disease. Smallpox came first, then measles, influenza, typhus, diseases that had circulated in European populations for centuries, creating partial immunity through generations of exposure. But in the Americas, These pathogens were entirely new. Indigenous immune systems had no defenses, no inherited resistance, no evolutionary preparation. When smallpox entered a Mohican village, it moved with terrifying speed. The infected developed fever, weakness, and then the characteristic pustules that covered skin and caused agonizing pain. Many died within days. Those who survived were often left disfigured, blinded, or permanently weakened. But the speed of death was not the worst part. The worst part was that the Mohicans had no framework to understand what was happening. In their worldview, illness had causes that could be identified and addressed: offended spirits, broken taboos, curses from enemies. Shamans could interpret the spiritual dimensions of sickness and prescribe remedies: rituals, herbs, isolation. These methods had worked for generations against the diseases they knew. But against smallpox, nothing worked. The rituals failed. The medicines were useless. People who had followed every tradition correctly still died. The spiritual framework that had made sense of suffering suddenly seemed powerless, and that powerlessness was as devastating as the disease itself. Entire villages were weakened within weeks. Not everyone died. Some had natural resistance, some contracted milder cases, some simply survived through chance. But enough died that social structures collapsed. Hunting parties couldn't be organized because too many hunters were sick or dead. Fields went unplanted because the women who tended them were incapacitated. Children orphaned by the epidemic had no one to care for them. The loss of elders was catastrophic in ways Europeans struggled to comprehend. In a culture built on oral tradition, elders were living libraries. They held generations of accumulated knowledge: medicinal plants, hunting techniques, navigation routes, diplomatic history, spiritual practices, and the stories that encoded all of it. When epidemics killed disproportionate numbers of elderly individuals, as they often did, entire archives of knowledge disappeared. Ceremonies that required specific chants, passed down through generations, could no longer be performed because no one remembered the words. Healing practices were lost because the shamans who knew them were dead. Historical knowledge of treaties and territorial boundaries evaporated. This created a spiritual crisis that compounded the physical devastation. If the spirits could not protect the people, if the rituals no longer worked, if elders who should have been wise enough to interpret these catastrophes were themselves dying, what did it mean? Were the Mohicans being punished for accepting European goods, for allowing missionaries among them, for failing to maintain traditions properly? Some turned more devoutly to traditional practices, believing stricter adherence would restore spiritual balance. Others converted to Christianity, reasoning that the European God must be more powerful if Europeans survived diseases that killed Mohicans. Communities fractured along these lines, religious divisions deepening at precisely the moment unity was most needed. Social structures that had sustained Mohican society for centuries began collapsing. Clan systems weakened when too many members died to maintain traditional roles. Leadership suffered when sachems and their likely successors died in the same epidemic. Marriages that should have created alliances between families couldn't occur because entire lineages had been wiped out. The population decline was staggering. Estimates suggest that diseases introduced by European contact killed between 50 to 90% of indigenous populations in the Americas. The Mohicans, living in areas with frequent European contact, likely suffered losses at the higher end of that range. Imagine villages that had housed hundreds reduced to dozens, hunting grounds that had supported thriving communities now largely empty, an entire people watching themselves disappear not through war or conquest, but through invisible agents they could not fight. And this happened without a single European soldier firing a shot, without armies marching through their territory, without formal declarations of war. The Mohicans were being destroyed by an enemy that arrived before Europeans even established permanent settlements, that spread through trade networks before colonization truly began, that killed more effectively than any military campaign. Europeans interpreted this devastation through their own frameworks: divine providence, clearing the land for Christian civilization, proof that God favored European expansion, evidence that indigenous peoples were too weak to deserve their territory. Some colonists genuinely mourned the deaths. Most simply saw opportunity, land becoming available, potential resistance weakening, indigenous populations becoming dependent on European support for survival. For the Mohicans, the epidemics created a before and after more absolute than any political or military event. Before, they had been a thriving confederacy capable of self-defense and complex diplomacy. After, they were a diminished people struggling to maintain coherence while hemorrhaging population, knowledge, and social structure. The silence that followed the sickness was profound. Villages that had echoed with children's laughter, communal discussions, and ceremonial songs fell quiet. Forests where hunters had tracked game for generations grew still. The Mohicans did not disappear entirely, but the world they had built hollowed out from within. And the cruelest aspect was that this devastation played out largely invisibly to history. No monuments marked the villages that died. No records documented the names of those who fell. The knowledge that vanished with the elders simply ceased to exist, leaving no trace that it had ever been. The Mohicans survived the epidemics in reduced numbers, but they survived into a world fundamentally transformed, where their diminished population made resistance harder, where lost knowledge made adaptation more difficult, where the balance of power had shifted irreversibly toward the colonists who kept arriving in ever-increasing numbers. The Mohicans had always understood warfare. Raids over hunting territory, disputes settled through combat, conflicts with neighboring tribes that could be brutal but were bounded by mutual understanding of what victory meant. War, in their world, had clear purposes and achievable endings. But beginning in the mid-1600s, the Mohicans found themselves pulled into conflicts they didn't start, couldn't fully comprehend, and gained nothing from winning. They became pawns in imperial wars between European powers who viewed indigenous peoples as resources to be deployed, not partners to be respected. The first major entanglement came with conflicts between the Dutch and English colonists competing for control of the Hudson River Valley. Both sides sought indigenous allies who knew the terrain, could move through forests where European soldiers stumbled, and would fight on behalf of colonial interests. The Mohicans, already weakened by epidemics and dependent on European trade goods, faced impossible choices: refuse alliance and risk losing access to the firearms and metal tools they now needed for survival and defense, ally with one power and make enemies of the other and its indigenous partners, remain neutral and become vulnerable to both sides who viewed non-alignment as potential hostility. They chose alliance with the English, reasoning that English settlements seemed more permanent and English trade more reliable than Dutch alternatives. It was a pragmatic decision based on incomplete information about how colonial conflicts actually worked. This alliance meant fighting for a foreign crown with no stake in Mohican well-being. When English and Dutch forces clashed, Mohican warriors were expected to fight alongside English militias. They served as scouts, guides, and shock troops who bore disproportionate casualties because colonial commanders viewed them as expendable. The Mohicans fought well. They brought tactical knowledge that European-trained soldiers lacked: how to move silently through forests, how to ambush enemies, how to survive on minimal supplies. Their contributions were militarily significant, but they were rarely acknowledged and never rewarded proportionally to their sacrifices. Promises were made constantly: fight for us and you'll be protected, help us win and your lands will be secure, prove your loyalty and you'll be treated as equals. The Mohicans, desperate for any guarantee of security in an increasingly hostile world, believed these promises, or at least hoped they might be honored. They were not. Each war brought losses the Mohicans could not afford. Warriors killed fighting battles that had nothing to do with Mohican interests. Resources consumed supporting military campaigns that benefited only colonists. Attention and energy diverted from the work of survival, hunting, planting, maintaining communities already stressed by disease and social disruption. And worse, fighting as English allies made the Mohicans targets for enemy tribes. Indigenous groups allied with the Dutch or French viewed the Mohicans as collaborators, legitimate targets who had chosen sides in conflicts that pitted native peoples against each other for European benefit. Raids intensified. Villages that had survived epidemics were now attacked by Mohawk warriors fighting for French interests, or by other tribes seeking revenge for Mohican actions on behalf of the English. The Mohicans found themselves in cascading cycles of violence, where each act of service to colonial allies triggered retaliation that weakened them further. The colonial powers who had recruited them offered minimal protection. English settlements that the Mohicans had fought to defend rarely reciprocated when Mohican villages came under attack. Colonial militias moved slowly, or not at all when indigenous allies needed support. The asymmetry was stark. The Mohicans were expected to fight for colonial interests, but colonists felt no equivalent obligation to defend Mohican interests. Land promises were particularly cruel. Colonial officials repeatedly assured the Mohicans that their service would be rewarded with secure territory, legal recognition of their lands, protection from encroachment. These promises were made solemnly, sometimes in writing, often in ceremonies designed to convey permanence. But they were never kept. After each war, when peace treaties were negotiated between European powers, indigenous interests were ignored or sacrificed. Land that had been promised to the Mohicans was given to colonial veterans as payment for military service. Boundaries that should have protected Mohican territory were redrawn to favor expansion. The people who had fought and died for colonial victory were erased from the accounting when rewards were distributed. This pattern repeated through King Philip's War in the 1670s, conflicts with the French throughout the late 1600s and early 1700s, and the larger imperial struggles that would culminate in the French and Indian War. Each time, the Mohicans fought. Each time, they suffered casualties. Each time, they were promised compensation that never materialized. Survival gradually transformed from a matter of strength to a matter of negotiation. The Mohicans could no longer defend themselves through military capability. Their population was too diminished, their resources too depleted. Instead, they survived by making themselves useful to whichever colonial power dominated their region, hoping that utility would translate into protection. But this dependency was degrading. Sachems, who had once led through wisdom and consensus, became supplicants petitioning colonial governors for permission to remain on their own land. Warriors who had fought as equals found themselves treated as subordinates, expected to follow orders without question. Communities that had governed themselves for millennia now lived at the mercy of colonial officials who viewed them as temporary inconveniences to be managed until they could be removed entirely. The Mohicans were trapped. Fighting for colonists accelerated their decline through casualties and resource depletion. Refusing to fight risked losing what little protection and access to goods they still possessed. There was no good choice, only degrees of bad options in a system designed to benefit Europeans at indigenous expense. And through all of this, the land they fought to protect was steadily disappearing. Not conquered in dramatic battles, but slipping away through treaties they couldn't read, legal frameworks they didn't understand, and colonial systems that treated indigenous presence as temporary obstacles rather than permanent rights. The Mohicans were not defeated in a single catastrophic battle. No army marched through their territory, burning villages and forcing surrender. Instead, they were dispossessed through a process far more insidious: legal theft disguised as voluntary agreement. It began with treaties. Colonial authorities invited Mohican leaders to negotiations, presenting documents written in English or Dutch, languages most Mohicans could not read. Interpreters, when available, often had conflicts of interest or lacked vocabulary to convey complex legal concepts that didn't exist in Mohican culture. The treaties purported to be land sales. Colonial negotiators would explain that the Mohicans were selling specific territories in exchange for goods, annual payments, or promises of protection. To the colonists, this was standard property transaction, payment exchanged for ownership. But the Mohicans operated from an entirely different understanding of land. In their worldview, land could not be owned in the sense Europeans meant. You could use land, hold stewardship over it, exclude others temporarily from hunting grounds. But selling land, transferring absolute permanent ownership that allowed the buyer to exclude everyone else forever, was a concept that had no equivalent in Mohican thought. When sachems agreed to these treaties, they often believed they were granting temporary use rights or permission to share territory, not surrendering ownership permanently. The colonial interpretation was radically different. Once a treaty was signed, the land belonged entirely and exclusively to colonists, and Mohican presence became trespassing. This fundamental misunderstanding enabled systematic dispossession. Mohicans would sell land, thinking they retained the right to hunt, fish, and travel through it. Colonists would build fences, establish farms, and enforce property boundaries that prohibited indigenous access. When Mohicans protested that this wasn't what they'd agreed to, colonists pointed to signed treaties as proof of sale. The pressure to sell was relentless. Colonial authorities used every available tool, offering alcohol during negotiations to impair judgment, threatening withdrawal of trade goods if sales didn't occur, suggesting that refusing to sell would be interpreted as hostility, manipulating internal Mohican politics by negotiating with leaders who lacked authority to speak for entire communities. Some sales occurred because Mohicans genuinely needed what was offered: supplies to survive harsh winters, ammunition for hunting, tools that had become essential, but these were transactions between parties with vastly unequal bargaining power. The Mohicans needed goods to survive. The colonists wanted land, but could survive without any particular parcel. Even when treaties were negotiated in relatively good faith, they were broken almost immediately. Boundaries specified in agreements were ignored. Annual payments promised in perpetuity stopped after a few years. Protection guaranteed in treaties never materialized when Mohican villages faced threats. Colonial authorities justified breaking treaties through legalistic arguments that Mohicans had no way to counter. A treaty might be voided because it was signed by a sachem who supposedly lacked authority, or reinterpreted to mean something different than originally stated, or simply ignored because colonial expansion made honoring it inconvenient, and the Mohicans had no recourse. Colonial legal systems didn't recognize indigenous peoples as having standing to sue or enforce contracts. Colonial courts were staffed by settlers with vested interests in expansion. Colonial governments answered to populations that benefited from dispossession and had no political incentive to protect indigenous rights. Meanwhile, settlements encroached steadily. What began as small trading posts became villages. Villages became towns. Towns sprawled into the countryside, clearing forests for farmland and timber. The landscape the Mohicans had known for millennia transformed with shocking speed. Forests where they had hunted became fenced pastures. Rivers they had fished were dammed for mills. Sacred sites were ploughed under or built over by colonists who had no idea or didn't care about their significance. The physical environment that had sustained Mohican identity was being erased and replaced. Each transformation removed pieces of what made Mohican life possible. Fewer hunting grounds meant less game. Depleted forests meant fewer materials for traditional crafts and shelter. Polluted rivers meant declining fish populations. The Mohicans were being starved out not through deliberate genocide, but through environmental destruction that made their way of life unsustainable. Forced relocations accelerated the dispossession. As colonial settlements expanded, remaining Mohican communities found themselves surrounded, cut off from resources they needed. Colonial authorities would then negotiate relocations, offering small reservations in exchange for abandoning traditional territories. These reservations were typically on land colonists didn't want: poor soil, limited game, isolated from trade routes. The Mohicans were being concentrated on the least desirable land while everything valuable was taken. And even these marginal reservations weren't permanent. Later treaties would shrink them further as colonial expansion continued. The cultural erosion was as devastating as the physical dispossession. Mohican identity was tied to specific places, particular rivers, mountains, forests where ancestors were buried and spirits dwelled. Being forced away from these places meant severing connections that had defined what it meant to be Mohican. Stories lost meaning when the landscapes they referenced were inaccessible. Ceremonies couldn't be performed when sacred sites were on private property. Knowledge about seasonal migration and resource management became irrelevant when the territory itself was gone. The Mohicans were not just losing land, they were losing the foundation of their culture. Young Mohicans, growing up on reservations, had no experience of the world their grandparents had known. They learned about traditional territories from stories, not lived experience. The gap between memory and reality widened with each generation, making it harder to maintain cultural continuity. Home was becoming memory. The physical place where Mohican identity had been rooted for thousands of years was transforming into something else entirely. A colonial landscape where indigenous presence was historical footnote rather than living reality. And through all of this, the Mohicans continued trying to negotiate, continued seeking legal recognition of their rights, continued believing that somehow the promises would be honored and dispossession would stop. But the trajectory was clear to anyone willing to see it. The Mohicans were being systematically erased from their own homeland through processes that looked legal, sounded reasonable, and accomplished what no military conquest had achieved: total dispossession without the moral complication of obvious violence. By the mid-1700s, the Mohicans were disappearing, not through mass death or military defeat, but through something more insidious: absorption into a colonial society that had no interest in preserving their distinct identity. The process began with practical necessity. Mohican communities, reduced by disease and confined to shrinking territories, needed ways to survive in a world increasingly dominated by colonial systems. Some moved to missions established by Christian organizations, where conversion and cultural assimilation were the price of food and protection. These mission communities taught Mohican children to read and write English, wear European clothing, practice Christianity, and abandon traditional customs labeled as pagan or savage. The stated goal was salvation and civilization. The actual effect was systematic erasure of everything that made Mohicans distinct from colonists. Language died first. Mohican, the Algonquian dialect that had carried stories, knowledge, and identity for millennia, stopped being passed to children. Parents who spoke Mohican often chose not to teach it, reasoning that English fluency would give their children better chances in the colonial world. Within 2 generations, native speakers became rare. Within 3, the language was nearly extinct. This linguistic death had cascading effects. Stories that only made sense in Mohican couldn't be translated adequately into English. Ceremonies requiring specific chants and prayers couldn't be performed correctly by people who spoke only colonial languages. The oral archive that had sustained Mohican identity for thousands of years simply ceased to function. Customs followed language into oblivion. Traditional dress was replaced by colonial clothing that marked wearers as civilized. Seasonal migrations ended because reservations were too small and surrounded by colonial settlements. Clan-based social organization weakened as Christian marriage practices replaced traditional kinship systems. The daily rhythms that had defined Mohican life dissolved. Some Mohicans tried to maintain traditions in private, away from colonial observation. But traditions require community to survive. Ceremonies need participants. Skills need teachers and students. Stories need audiences. As Mohican communities scattered and integrated into colonial society, the social infrastructure necessary for cultural continuity collapsed. Intermarriage accelerated assimilation. Mohican men married colonial women. Mohican women married colonial men. In a society already devastated by population loss, exogamy was sometimes the only way to form families. But children of mixed unions often identified with the dominant colonial culture rather than the marginalized indigenous one. Colonial society encouraged this. A Mohican who married a colonist, adopted Christianity, spoke English and wore European clothing could achieve a kind of acceptance, never full equality, but at least tolerance. Their children, especially if they looked European, could potentially integrate completely. The incentive structure rewarded assimilation and punished visible indigeneity. This created a cruel dynamic. Identity became diluted across generations, not because people wanted to abandon it, but because maintaining it carried social and economic costs that survival sometimes couldn't afford. Being visibly Mohican meant discrimination, limited opportunities, and constant reminders that you were considered inferior. Concealing or minimizing indigenous identity was rational adaptation to hostile circumstances. But adaptation came at the cost of visibility. As Mohicans integrated into colonial society, they became invisible as Mohicans. Census records listed them as colored or simply omitted racial classification. Legal documents described them as individuals, not as members of a distinct people. Historical accounts mentioned them in past tense, as if they had already ceased to exist. The Mohican name itself began fading from use. Some descendants adopted anglicized surnames, others moved to regions where no one knew their ancestry. Communities that had been identifiably Mohican became generically Indian or mixed-race settlements where specific tribal identity was lost or forgotten. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, history was moving forward without the Mohicans. Colonial documents that had once negotiated with them now barely acknowledged their existence. Maps that had labeled Mohican territories now showed only colonial townships. The land, the culture, the people, all were being written out of the present tense and relegated to past. This erasure was nearly complete, but it was not total. Small groups maintained Mohican identity despite overwhelming pressure to assimilate. Some communities in western Massachusetts and Connecticut preserved oral traditions, even as the language died. A few families passed down stories about ancestors, about the land that had been home, about what it meant to be Mohican, even when the world insisted that identity was extinct. In 1734, a Mohican community relocated to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, establishing what became known as the Stockbridge Indians. They tried to adapt while preserving identity, accepting Christianity and education while maintaining distinct political organization. But even this community faced continual displacement, forced westward as colonial expansion consumed even the small spaces they had been promised. By the early 1800s, Remnants of Mohican communities had been pushed to New York, then Wisconsin, then finally to a small reservation in Shawano County, Wisconsin, thousands of miles from their ancestral homeland. They survived, but survival required becoming something different from what their ancestors had been. The tragedy was not that the Mohicans died out. The tragedy was that they survived while being told they didn't exist, that descendants carrying Mohican blood and memory lived in a society that had concluded the Mohicans were extinct, that a people who had adapted and endured despite everything thrown at them were erased from consciousness simply because they no longer looked or lived the way colonists expected authentic Indians to appear. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their disappearance. It happened while they were still alive. They vanished from history while still walking through it, still carrying stories, still remembering who they had been, even as the world around them insisted they were gone. In 1826, James Fenimore Cooper published a novel titled The Last of the Mohicans. It became one of the most popular books in American history, adapted countless times for stage, screen, and popular imagination. It created an image of the Mohicans that millions would come to accept as truth, but almost everything in it was fiction. Cooper's novel told the story of Hawkeye, a white frontiersman, and his Mohican companions, Chingachgook and Uncas, during the French and Indian War. The narrative climaxed with Uncas's death, portrayed as the tragic end of the Mohican people, the last of a noble but doomed race unable to survive the inevitable march of civilization. It was romantic, dramatic, emotionally compelling, and it was historically false. The Mohicans were not extinct in 1826. They were living in New York and preparing for another forced relocation westward. Real Mohican communities existed, with real people trying to survive despite displacement and marginalization. Cooper knew this, or should have known it, but accuracy was less important than creating a narrative that satisfied what white readers wanted to hear. The myth of the last indigenous person became a powerful literary and cultural trope in 19th century America. It allowed settlers to mourn indigenous peoples while simultaneously justifying their dispossession. The story went, these people were noble but primitive, tragic but inevitable casualties of progress, worthy of sympathy but not rights or recognition. Cooper's novel didn't create this narrative, but it crystallized and popularized it. The Last of the Mohicans became shorthand for indigenous extinction, a story that made dispossession palatable by framing it as natural tragedy rather than deliberate policy. The book's success meant that fiction replaced history in public consciousness. When people heard Mohican, they thought of Cooper's characters, not actual communities. The romanticized image of noble savages vanishing into the wilderness became more real than the living descendants struggling for recognition. This fictional erasure had real consequences. If the Mohicans were extinct, then they had no claims to land, no rights requiring recognition, no voice demanding to be heard. The myth of extinction justified ignoring actual Mohican people who insisted on their continued existence. Later adaptations amplified the distortion. Films turned the story into visual spectacle. Dramatic battles, tragic romances, sweeping landscapes empty except for the doomed protagonists. Each retelling reinforced the same message. The Mohicans were past, not present. History, not contemporary reality. The tragedy was turned into entertainment. The suffering of dispossession became plot device. The erasure of a culture became a satisfying narrative arc with clear beginning, middle, and end. Audiences could experience the emotional catharsis of witnessing noble savagery vanish while feeling no responsibility for the systems that had caused it. Meanwhile, real Mohican descendants lived invisible lives. In the 1800s, the Stockbridge Munsee Band, the primary Mohican community that had survived displacement, struggled for recognition from a government that treated them as inconvenient complications. to the official narrative of indigenous extinction. They filed petitions asserting their existence and rights. They maintained community organization despite being scattered across multiple states. They preserved what cultural memory they could despite language loss and forced assimilation. But their actual survival was less interesting to broader society than Cooper's fictional extinction. This created a perverse situation where Mohican descendants had to argue against their own supposed extinction. They had to prove they were real to a society that had accepted fiction as fact. Every petition, every legal claim, every assertion of identity was met with skepticism rooted in the cultural certainty that the last Mohican had died generations ago. The cost of being remembered incorrectly was perhaps worse than being forgotten entirely. At least forgotten peoples might reclaim their histories without fighting against established myths. But the Mohicans had to combat not just erasure, but replacement. Their actual history buried under layers of romantic fiction that had become more culturally powerful than truth. Academic historians eventually corrected the record, documenting Mohican survival and the real history of displacement. But academic correction had limited reach compared to popular culture. Cooper's novel remained in print, taught in schools, adapted for new audiences. The myth persisted because it was more emotionally satisfying than the complex, uncomfortable reality. The real story offered no neat resolution. The Mohicans survived, but were fundamentally transformed by forces beyond their control. They maintained identity while losing most of what had originally defined it. They endured, but at costs that are still being calculated generations later. This was survival without victory, persistence without restoration. That story didn't fit the narratives 19th and early 20th century America wanted to tell itself. The myth of the noble vanishing Indian allowed settlers to feel sympathy without guilt, to mourn without restitution, to remember without recognition. It turned genocide and dispossession into tragedy beyond anyone's control, rather than the result of deliberate policies that benefited colonizers. And so the Mohicans existed in dual states, alive in reservation communities and scattered descendants, but dead in public imagination, present in census records and tribal roles, but absent from cultural consciousness, visible to themselves, invisible to history. This split between reality and representation haunts Mohican descendants to this day. They carry memory of who their ancestors were, knowledge of what was lost, and the burden of existence that much of America refuses to acknowledge because it's more comfortable to believe the myth. The cost of being remembered incorrectly is that your truth becomes contestable, your existence becomes debatable, your survival becomes something you have to prove repeatedly to audiences who would prefer you remain safely extinct in romantic fiction rather than present with claims and voices demanding acknowledgement. And perhaps that's the final cruelty. The Mohicans were erased, not once but twice. First from their land, then from memory, replaced by fiction that served the emotional needs of colonizers better than truth ever could. The Mohicans were not erased in fire, they were erased in silence, not by a single enemy, but by time, disease, treaties, and forgetting. They didn't lose a final battle, they lost the right to be seen. If you believe forgotten histories deserve to be told, subscribe to Fragments of History, like the video to support the channel, and tell us in the comments, should survival count as extinction or resistance?